Germany had better radar than Britain, more advanced, more accurate. And when German engineers examined the British chain-home system, they literally couldn't understand how something that crude could work. That single fact contains the entire Battle of Britain. Not the Spitfires, not the Blitz spirit, not Churchill's speeches. A failure of comprehension so complete that the most powerful air force on earth threw away a victory it was already winning. Voltaire wrote it in 1772. Le mieux est l'ennemi du bien. The best is the enemy of the good. German perfectionism, the very quality that made their radar technically superior, became the cognitive prison that blinded them to what was actually happening on the other side of the Channel. By the summer of 1940, France had fallen in 6 weeks. The Low Countries had crumbled. Norway was occupied. Across that narrow stretch of grey sea, the Wehrmacht massed divisions and invasion barges. And the Luftwaffe, the most battle-tested air force on the planet, stood ready to do what it had never failed to do: win air superiority. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring told Hitler it would take 4 days to neutralize fighter command south of London. 4 weeks to destroy the RAF entirely. He said this with the confidence of a man who had watched his aircraft obliterate Polish airfields, flatten Rotterdam, and shatter the French Armée de l'Air. Göring didn't understand what he was attacking. He was culturally, institutionally, and temperamentally incapable of understanding it. Because the British had built something no nation had ever built before: the world's first integrated air defense system. And they'd built it around a radar network so crude that trained German engineers dismissed it as junk. Here's the evidence for that claim. Germany's Freya early warning radar operated at 120 to 130 MHz on a 1.2 meter wavelength. Genuinely superior miniaturization and precision engineering. The Würzburg precision tracking radar could lock on to individual aircraft with focused beam technology that represented the state of the art. These were serious instruments, designed by some of the finest electrical engineers in the world. Germany was meaningfully ahead in radar technology. Chain-home, by contrast, looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts by enthusiastic amateurs. Steel lattice transmitter towers stood 360 feet tall. Wooden receiver towers rose to 240 feet. The system operated between 20 and 55 MHz, a 12-meter wavelength that was enormous by German standards. Where every other nation's radar engineers pursued the obvious approach of sweeping a focused beam across the sky like a searchlight, Chain-home used a floodlight principle, blasting radio energy outward in a broad wash and relying on highly trained operators to interpret the messy echoes bouncing back. No elegance, no precision, and a maximum detection range of up to 320 kilometers, roughly 200 miles, that dwarfed Freya's 120 to 160 kilometers. Chain-home lacked refinement, but it saw farther than anything the Germans had, and it saw far enough. One technical detail reveals the philosophical gulf between the two nations better than any strategic analysis could. Adjacent chain-home stations, transmitting on similar frequencies, risked creating destructive interference, a phenomenon called running rabbits, where unsynchronized pulses generated ghost returns on each other's screens. Eliminating this required precise coordination across the entire network. Building custom precision oscillators for every station along the English coast would have been expensive and time-consuming. British engineers chose a different path. They synchronized the entire chain-home network to the national grid's 50 Hz AC frequency, using the mains electrical supply as a phase-locked reference and triggering each station at a different phase point within the cycle. The early warning radar network defending Great Britain was, in a very real sense, running off the wall socket. German engineers would never have done this. Synchronizing a military radar system to a civilian electrical grid was inelegant, vulnerable to power fluctuations, offensive to every principle of precision instrument design. And it worked, because working mattered more than elegance.
Before Robert Watson Watt ever demonstrated that radio waves could detect aircraft, before the famous Daventry experiment of February 26, 1935, he'd already cracked the problem of tracking thunderstorms using radio direction finding techniques at the Radio Research Station in Slough. He did this in 1932, not 1934, as commonly and erroneously stated. That earlier date matters because it reveals a pattern. British radar development was never about perfection. Watson Watt himself reportedly insisted that the cult of the imperfect was the right approach. Give the military something that works now, rather than something perfect that arrives too late. But the radar stations themselves were only the first link in a chain, and the chain is what actually won the battle. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had taken command of Fighter Command in 1936, and from day one he'd been building something that transcended any single technology. Dowding was prickly, stubborn, socially awkward. His colleagues called him Stuffy, for reasons immediately apparent to anyone who spent 5 minutes in his company. He possessed no charisma. What he possessed instead was a quality rarer in a military officer than courage, the ability to think in systems. He understood that a radar station detecting an incoming raid was meaningless unless that information could flow in real time through filter rooms, operations rooms, and sector stations, arriving in a fighter pilot's cockpit as an actionable intercept vector before the bombers reached their targets. The Dowding system worked like this. Chain home stations detected incoming aircraft and telephoned raw data, bearing, estimated range, altitude, numbers, to the filter room at Bentley Priory, Dowding's headquarters in Stanmore, northwest of London. Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters pushed markers across vast map tables, while officers in the gallery above watched the picture develop. Filtered data was cross-referenced with reports from the Royal Observer Corps, whose volunteers tracked aircraft visually and by sound once they crossed the coastline, since radar couldn't track inland. From Bentley Priory, the picture flowed down to group operations rooms, most critically 11 Group under Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, covering southeast England, and then to individual sector stations like Biggin Hill, Kenley and Hornchurch, where controllers vectored specific squadrons onto incoming raids. The entire cycle, from radar detection to fighters receiving intercept vectors, could be completed in minutes. No other country on Earth had anything remotely like it. Post-war systems engineering analysis reached a conclusion that should haunt every technologist who believes superior hardware guarantees victory. So even though Germany had better radar technology, the RAF integrated their adequate technology into a system and used it to help win the battle. Germany had no such system, and its leadership had no interest in building one. German signals intelligence had detected Chain Home's 360-foot towers along the English coast. They weren't exactly subtle, but the assessment of what those towers actually did was catastrophically wrong. German radars worked best for sea surveillance, and German intelligence assumed Britain's coastal stations served the same purpose, just using a less suitable wavelength. They categorized Chain Home as a naval early warning network, an army attacking a fortress without realizing the fortress had walls. The battle opened in July 1940 with probing attacks on Channel convoys. During these early engagements, Luftwaffe pilots reported with increasing frustration that RAF fighters seemed to appear from nowhere. Already at the correct altitude, already heading toward the incoming raid, as if they knew it was coming. They did know. The dowding system was feeding them the information in near real time, and Fighter Command could husband its limited resources with surgical economy, scrambling only what was needed instead of maintaining exhausting standing patrols. On August 12, 1940, the day before Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe's planned knockout blow, German bombers hit chain home stations at Ventnor, Dunkirk near Canterbury, Pevensey and Rye. Ventnor was seriously damaged and taken off the air. Most other stations were back online within hours. The tall steel transmitter towers were hard to destroy because bombs tended to pass between the lattice structures. Wooden receiver towers could be quickly repaired or replaced.
3 days later, on August 15th, Göring delivered his verdict. It's doubtful whether there is any point in continuing attacks on radar sites in view of the fact that not one of those attacked so far has been put out of action. He stopped the attacks. Göring viewed radar and electronic warfare as gadgetry, beneath the dignity of the Luftwaffe's warrior culture. His air force worshipped the heroic pilot, the screaming dive bomber, the thunder of massed engines. The quiet hum of oscilloscopes held no romance for him, and therefore no value. General Wolfgang Martini, head of Luftwaffe signals, understood radio technology. But in a command structure dominated by Göring's ego and Hitler's strategic whims, technical intelligence was subordinate to ideological conviction. Post-war analysis was unequivocal. The failure to remove British radar removed any chance for surprise during the Battle of Britain, and it was the key element in the German failure. Having dismissed the radar stations as not worth the bombs, the Luftwaffe pivoted to what should have been the correct strategy from the start: destroying Fighter Command's infrastructure on the ground. Beginning in late August, waves of bombers struck the sector airfields that formed the nerve centres of the dowding system. Biggin Hill was hit repeatedly, its operations room destroyed, hangars burning, runways cratered. Kenley took devastating raids. Hornchurch, Manston, North Weald, hammered in succession. The attacks were working. During the brutal stretch from August 24th to September 6th, Fighter Command buckled. August 31st was the worst day. 39 aircraft lost, 14 pilots killed. Trained fighter pilots couldn't be replaced at the rate they were being killed or wounded. New arrivals from training units were being shot down on their first or second sortie, lacking the combat experience to survive against Luftwaffe veterans who'd been fighting since Spain. Keith Park was feeding pilots into combat who had fewer than 20 hours on Hurricanes. Sector stations were damaged, some barely functional. The landline telephone network, carrying filtered radar data from Bentley Priory to the sector stations, was being cut faster than engineers could splice it back together. Among the pilots absorbing those losses were men who'd already lost one country. 303 Squadron, the Kosciuszko Squadron, had been held back from combat initially over concerns about language barriers and unfamiliarity with RAF procedures. When they were finally committed, they became the highest-scoring Hurricane Squadron of the entire battle. Witold Urbanowicz and Józef František, Czech-born but flying with the Polish squadrons, fought with an intensity born of having already lost one homeland and refusing to lose another. František became the highest-scoring Allied ace of the Battle of Britain. Their contribution was disproportionate to their numbers. And still the Luftwaffe pressed its advantage against the airfields. Some historians dispute the 2 weeks from collapse narrative, noting that aircraft production under Lord Beaverbrook was actually outpacing losses. Fair enough. But pilot losses weren't replaceable at the same rate, and the degradation of sector stations was threatening the command and control architecture that made everything else work. The machine was still running. It was running on fumes. Any honest assessment of Fighter Command's situation on September 6, 1940, would have concluded that time was on the Luftwaffe's side. Then the Germans threw it all away. On the night of August 24th, a group of Luftwaffe bombers, likely lost or acting against orders, dropped bombs on central London. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. Physical damage was negligible. The psychological impact on Hitler was volcanic. He had personally guaranteed the German people that Berlin would never be bombed.
On September 4th, he raged in a speech about British night pirates and promised to raise British cities. Göring saw the pivot to bombing London as a chance to restore his own prestige. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe switched targets. Nearly 1,000 aircraft headed not for Biggin Hill, not for Kenley, not for any of the battered sector stations that were one or two more raids from going dark. They headed for London. The Blitz had begun. And Fighter Command, which had been bleeding to death on operating tables in shattered airfield buildings across southeast England, suddenly found that nobody was bombing its airfields anymore. Runways were repaired, operations rooms were rebuilt, communications lines were restored. Pilots got something they hadn't had in weeks: rest. September 15th, 1940, Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe launched what it intended to be the decisive blow against London. Park, working from the underground operations room at Uxbridge, committed every squadron he had. Every single one. Churchill, visiting that day, asked Park what reserves remained. "There are none," Park replied. But the dowding system, battered but unbroken, had reasserted its grip on the air picture, and fighters launched with vectors, altitudes, and headings. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 60 aircraft. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, indefinitely. Even as the Battle of Britain raged, two physicists at the University of Birmingham, John Randall and Harry Boot, were completing work on the cavity magnetron, enabling centimetric radar that would revolutionize the technology. The Tizard mission carried this device to America in September 1940, where it was called the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. British engineering wasn't just about making crude systems work, it was also capable of genuine breakthroughs. But the men who'd built and commanded the system that saved Britain didn't get to enjoy the victory. Within weeks of the battle's end, the politics consumed them. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory of 12 Group had spent the battle agitating against Park's tactics, advocating big wing formations, massing 60 fighters into massive groups before engaging. The concept had a superficial logic and an ambitious champion. Leigh-Mallory, backed by Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas, pressured the Air Ministry. In October 1940, Park was summoned to an Air Ministry meeting where he was essentially ambushed, forced to defend his tactical decisions before officers who'd already decided to replace him. Park had employed Dowding's system with ruthless economy, committing squadrons in pairs because raids crossed the Channel so fast there simply wasn't time to assemble big wings before the bombs fell. Getting 12 fighters into position immediately was infinitely more valuable than getting 60 fighters into position after the targets had already been hit. The evidence supported Park completely. The battle had been won using his methods. None of that mattered. Dowding was pushed into retirement. Park was removed from 11 Group and sent to a training command, a humiliation for the man who had directed the frontline air defence of Britain during the most critical weeks in the nation's history.
Sholto Douglas replaced Dowding at Fighter Command. Lee Mallory eventually got 11 Group. These two men, Dowding the systems architect and Park the operational commander, had saved their country. Their reward was dismissal by political rivals who advocated the very tactics that would have lost the battle. The best, once again, was the enemy of the good. Career ambition defeated operational reality.
The Voltaire principle that explained German failure at the strategic level explained British failure at the institutional level. Keith Park eventually found redemption in the Mediterranean and Pacific theatres, where his tactical brilliance was again demonstrated. A statue of him now stands at Waterloo Place in London, a belated acknowledgement that the city he had defended with such skill and such personal cost had not forgotten him. Dowding spent his later years in relative obscurity, never receiving the peerage that commanders of comparable significance routinely received. Germany had better radar. Germany had more aircraft. Germany had pilots hardened by campaigns across Europe. And Germany lost because its leadership couldn't comprehend that a crude system, integrated correctly and commanded by unglamorous men who understood what actually mattered, would always defeat superior technology deployed in isolation by leaders who despised the very concept of systematic thinking. Göring dismissed radar as gadgetry. The Air Ministry dismissed Dowding and Park as inconvenient. Both failures share the same root: the inability to recognize that what works matters more than what impresses. Subscribe for more stories like this.